There are many schools of thought when it comes to what you should eat if you have cancer. There are even more foods that we are told to avoid. It's almost like everything we can eat is considered toxic or bad for us in some way. Acidic, inflammatory, aggravates our gut, makes us fat, increases our blood sugar, activates our immune system so we get sensitivities, allergies, or is toxic or bad for us on some level or the planet. It's overwhelming. And overwhelm leads to confusion, which leads to inaction. And I'm here to help with that. This is the place to start. This is step one. If you just got diagnosed with cancer or are still dealing with cancer, this is the list for you. I'm going to share my top 9 list of foods to avoid, professionally curated. If you do this, you will be ahead of the curve. If you already do this, you can feel real good about yourself and know that it is now time to take your health to the next level. The spirit of this video is not, yeah, you should probably avoid these things. It's for the love of God, the universe, or yourself at least. Please, if you see these foods, run the other way. But the real value of this list, one of them may surprise you, by the way, but the real value of this list is that I prioritize them in a way that is the most bang for your buck, so to speak, the most benefit for your physical health with the least amount of sacrifice. Hi, I'm Dr. Lisa Mateka, and I am a cancer transformation guide, naturopathic physician, energy worker, and transformational life coach, and I help those with cancer navigate their journey to activating their own innate healing power and potential physically, mentally, emotionally, energetically, and spiritually. Besides my education and credentials on this topic, I'm pulling from my own research and years of experience working with cancer patients. Now, this time I'm not going to bore you with all of the scientific studies and whatnot, because most of these should come as no surprise and you probably won't need any convincing, although there is one or two that you might. So I will be highlighting some of the reasons why they're best to avoid. But again, the beauty and power of this list is that I prioritized so many things that are bad for you, especially if you have cancer. And I narrowed them down to this top 9 to avoid if you have cancer, which, by the way, are in no particular order. All right, let's get started. All right, number 1 is artificial sweeteners, especially aspartame, number 1, then acesulfame K, number 2, then sucralose, number 3. Do any of you drink diet soda? You need to throw it away now. Oh my gosh. Okay, I said these are in no particular order, but if I were to choose an order, artificial sweeteners are number 1, the worst, one of the worst things you could ever put in your body. And aspartame, yes, especially. So what I'm about to say goes for all artificial sweeteners, but just know the worst is aspartame, which still is in many diet sodas, then acesulfame K, which is basically a derivative, and then sucralose. Sucralose is a tricky one these days because it's in a lot of things that are considered healthy. Although if it has sucralose in it, it no longer contains any health benefits. Sucralose is in a lot of pretty much every energy drink you can buy that says sugar-free anyways. Pretty much any energy drink these days has the sucralose. Sucralose is actually in a lot of protein powders and workout powders. So it's insidious. You really have to look. So artificial sweeteners are absolutely horrible for you. Avoid them like the plague. Why? So many more reasons than I can even get into. But yes, they definitively increase your risk for any type of cancer, which means if you already have a cancer, it's just going to make it worse. And this is especially the most worse for breast cancer and obesity related cancers. And there's a whole host of other things they do. They're excitotoxins, so they actually contribute to emotional problems, and emotional health is very important in cancer. They increase anxiety, stress, depression, the last thing you need when you have cancer. It's addictive. By the way, it increases your appetite and it does not help you lose weight. Yes. And just to be clear, because some people think artificial sweeteners are anything that's not sugar, not cane sugar, and that's not true. So just to be clear, I think this is pretty clear probably, but just to be sure, artificial sweeteners are not things like, things that are natural like honey, maple syrup, agave, stevia, monk fruit. That we're not talking about those things. We're talking about mostly aspartame, asulfame K, saccharin, sucralose. And so, man, this is so bad, you guys. When I see people at the grocery store with diet soda, I feel so bad because part of me feels like it's my moral obligation to tell them, no, what are you doing? That's so bad for you. But I never do that because a bigger part of me is like, okay, everyone needs to make their own choices, but what if they're not informed choices? But I also know human psychology enough to know that if I were to tell them to not get it, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. They're going to get it. They're going to get defensive about their choices. So I think most people know at this point that artificial sweeteners are bad for them, just like, people know smoking is bad for them. It's just, they don't care. Or they just think it's still somehow, or they think it is still better than sugar. It's not. It's better to do straight up cane sugar. Which does lead me to number two. Number two is sugar, straight up cane sugar, as well as high fructose corn syrup. So, as we know, it is a very well established fact at this point that glucose, which is what the sugar turns into in your body, glucose feeds and fuels cancer cells. It feeds and fuels cancer cells and tumors. So, really, one of the first things you should be cutting is sugars. And remember, sugar it's also very insidious. It's in everything. So, of course, the best thing to eat is as natural, whole food as possible. But if that's not your reality, do check labels. Check the labels of everything you eat. There's likely some type of sugar in there, and high fructose corn syrup counts as sugar because that's what it is. And high fructose corn syrup is doubly bad because it's got the corn component, and it's not that corn itself is bad, but in most of the world, corn is Monsanto genetically modified, or at least genetically modified, and that's bad, and we'll get into that. So high fructose corn syrup in most parts of the world is genetically modified, so that makes it doubly bad. But either way, it's sugar, it spikes the glucose, that's bad, that's very bad for cancer. And so it's just so ridiculous to me that so many cancer centers, conventional cancer centers, but even some that have some integrative components, I won't name any names, they'll still have bowls of cancer at their facility. It's absolutely ridiculous. So yes, check the labels, avoid sugar. I'm not supposed to be getting into what you should do instead, but I will say if I had to choose, like I'm not gonna get into which of the different sugar alternatives are the best and pros and cons. That can be a whole nother video itself. But I would say the absolute best, if you need a sweetener substitute, is to grow your own stevia. It's easy to grow, and dry those leaves and use that. Because even stevia in the store, a lot of especially that white powder stuff, it's still processed, quite processed. So there's a little bonus for you. But yes, I think that's all that really needs to be said about that. It's also shown that people who, have higher blood sugar, if they're pre-diabetic or diabetic, and if they get their glucose under control, and I'm talking about cancer patients, when they get their glucose under control, they have a much higher likelihood of healing from cancer. So, it's quite established Sugar, glucose, fuels and feeds cancer. So don't do that. Okay, and then number 3 is pork. So, of course, there's going to be lots of people that argue you should avoid all meat if you have cancer. I'm not even going that far today because, like I said, the point of this list is like, it's like really, really the top things you should avoid, the really, really important, obvious, vital ones. So, even if I do think you should avoid all meat and cancer, that's not what this list is. This list is the ones you need to run from. So, that's why we're going to talk specifically about pork. Pork. Don't you find it interesting? I always did that whenever people start to, be curious about becoming vegetarian or vegan, pork is always the first thing they give up. It just is. And a lot of times people don't even know why. It's just like intuitively, it seems to be the most disgusting and just the one they want to give up first. And then you think about how there's cultures and religions that absolutely do not eat pork. So you got to wonder, is there something to this? And there is. It is confirmed that pork is the most easily contaminated meat. It is the most easily contaminated meat. Your body can go into toxic shock syndrome from it. Even if you don't notice anything bad happening, it's because your immune system is working extra hard to process everything that's in there. And trust me, when you have cancer, you need every last bit of energy that your immune system has. You need your immune system to be focusing on the cancer, not on processing pork. There's lots of parasites, lots of viruses, and that's another reason why it's bad for cancer, because there's already a really firm link between parasites and viruses and cancer. And it's just a very low quality meat. So another thing is the toxic burden. Like, never mind even the microorganisms like the parasites and the viruses, but let's just say the filthiness of the meat. It is a low quality meat because pigs essentially eat anything. They eat garbage, they eat dead things, they eat shit, and all of that turns to meat on their bones, and it's a low quality meat. And if you're into energetics, it's a very low vibration meat. You don't want that. And this is nothing against pigs. Pigs themselves are beautiful creatures, smart, cute, all of that. But it's part of their survival, of part of, who they are, to be able to survive off eating these bad things that leads to bad meat. So I think that's all I'll say about that. When it comes to cancer, you don't want to increase your toxins, you want to decrease them. You don't want to increase your parasites and viruses, you want to decrease them. And you don't want to overwork your immune system because you want it to focus on the cancer. And that is why you do not want to eat the pork. Even the American Cancer Society, which, by the way, I have little faith in, little love for, but even they say to greatly limit processed meats like bacon and sausages. And that's the other problem with pork, is most of it is highly processed because it's things like bacon and sausage. And that adds a whole another layer of unhealthiness because it's the process, process being bad, which hopefully you understand, and I don't need to get into that part. And even if it's not processed, like just a pork chop or something, well, I think I made my point about the pork already. So, number 4 is non-grass-fed beef and dairy. Okay, I'm sorry. It is another animal one for you meat lovers out there. Pork, like I said, is more important to avoid, but this is also good to avoid, okay? Cows are meant to eat grass. They are designed to eat grass. They really are supposed to and kind of need to eat grass to be healthy. And if they're healthy, their meat is healthy. But that is typically not what most people are eating, If they're eating grains, which they oftentimes are, so they can get bigger and fatter, that's, first of all, bad for them, which means it's bad meat. It's genetically modified. And then, of course, there's the hormones, which also leads to hormonal problems, all of that stuff. Not to mention, I'm sorry to break it to you if you didn't know this, but if it's not grass-fed beef or dairy, then those cows are not only fed genetically modified corns and hormones and things that are awful, but they're also fed dead, ground up cows. So they're cannibalizing them, and dead, ground up horses. Oh, not just dead and ground up, but diseased and dead, ground up other cows and horses, which is absolutely disgusting and not good. That's why we have a lot of problems sometimes with the meat, like mad cow disease or whatever. And again, even if you don't get sick and it's fine, in quotes, it's still hard on your immune system. And the American Cancer Society, which I think not too highly of, but even they say to limit or decrease all red meats because there is epidemiological evidence that red meat leads to increased risk of cancer, which means if you already have cancer, red meat consumption can make it worse. So, in my opinion, you should avoid all red meat if you have cancer. But because I said this list is like of the utmost priorities, I'm just going to say non-grass-fed beef and dairy should be avoided. And then when it comes to meat as well, the more processed it is, the worse it is. And also, all of the following are bad to do to your meats if you're going to eat meats: frying, grilling, charring, smoking, barbecuing, salting, for various reasons. Some of those processes add nitrites to the meat. Some of those processes add advanced glycation end products, which are toxic and bad for you and, can create cell damage. And some of those processes, like the frying, it's added oils and unhealthy things. So those are the ones that are, if you're going to eat meat, try not to do those things. And the more processed the meat is, the worse. So yes, try to avoid the non-grass-fed beef and dairy, but even more so, try to avoid the pork when it comes to meat. Still number one, in my opinion, is the aspartame and other artificial sweeteners, and then sugar. All right, number 5. Okay, I promise this is the last animal on the list. Shellfish. This is the one I thought might surprise people because it is thought that seafood is healthy, and indeed, there is a lot of seafood that is healthy for you, especially if it's not toxic with mercury. But here's the thing about shellfish, and actually, I'm going to take it a step further. In this category is not only shellfish, but any kind of sea creature that doesn't have fins and scales. So that means shellfish, that means squid, octopus, and catfish. Okay, why? All of these creatures are either bottom feeders or they're natural filters, which means they have the highest toxic load and they have the highest probability of getting people sick. That's why so often people get sick from these kinds of foods. And again, even if you don't get sick, that doesn't mean it's not having an effect on your body. Your immune system is working extra hard processing it, and we want the immune system to focus on the cancer. And they're still just laden with toxins. If you have cancer, the chances are that your toxic load is heavy already, and what you need to be doing is decreasing it, not increasing it. That's why it's so important with cancer to do things like cleanses and detoxes. So let's not add to it with these, higher toxic things that have, because they're filters or bottom feeders, they have more toxins essentially. Now again, once you're healthy and well again, you can eat these things every now and again. Some of these, never the aspartame. But some of these things, I would say, like the shellfish, you can eat again when you're well, but not now. Absolutely not now. I'm going to give you all a bonus since we're halfway through this list. Yes, because animals are at the top of the food chain, they often acquire the most toxins, but I just want to play a little bit fair here, and vegetables can be toxic too. That's why it's best, if possible, to eat organic, but that's not always feasible with how expensive it is, and sometimes it's hard to find. So at the very least, you want to avoid the dirty dozen. Perhaps you've heard of this before. The dirty dozen are the most pesticide-laden foods because they're typically foods where you're not like peeling them or they're not like under the ground. So the dirty dozen foods that you want to avoid, conventional, and only get organic. I'm not saying avoid these foods. I'm saying these you want only organic. And that's the dirty dozen, which are things like your leafy greens like spinach, kale, collard, and mustard greens, um, berries, apples, nectarines, peaches, pears, grapes, tomatoes, celery, and peppers. I think I got them all. So number 6 is GMOs, genetically modified organisms. This is one I recommend to still avoid even once you become well from cancer, still avoid these. So there are definitely some myths and misinformation out there that GMOs have no problems and there's never been any documented, verifiable, true research on GMOs being bad for you. That is the misinformation. There is definitely plenty of evidence that shows GMOs are bad for you, and there's plenty of faulty evidence, flawed research, should we say, tampered with research that may show GMOs are not bad for you, but trust me, they are. Try to stay away from GMOs as much as possible. It can be very hard. You can look on any labels. That's another reason why it's great to get organic. But you can look at labels. Sometimes it'll straight up say this product contains a bioengineered food product. Don't get it. There's a lot of products that'll be verified, from the GMO project, verified GMO free. It's usually that little picture with the butterfly. It might be different in your country, but look for something that says GMO free or try to get organic as much as possible. This also means if you're in like the Western world, most of it, even other countries, I would say probably most of the world, but it's going to vary. This means avoiding all corn. Definitely in the US and Canada. I guess I can't speak to all the other countries, but in the US and Canada and much of the developed Western world, all corn is GMO, and that sucks. Probably you're safe if you're like in Central America or some other places, and then unfortunately, all soy, or most soy, not all, most soy in the US, Canada, and the Western world is GMO as well, which also really sucks because soy itself is not necessarily bad for you at all. It's the GMO that makes it so. So why do we want to avoid GMOs? It does contribute to cancer. It does, which means if you already have it, it's not good to keep putting that in your body. But there's so many things it does for your health. All sorts of gastrointestinal problems, bloating, food sensitivities, contributing to high blood pressure, hormonal problems, brain fog, anxiety. And also GMOs increase your appetite, which is not a bad thing with cancer, but I'm just saying in general for like the risk factor of obesity, which is a risk factor for cancer. It makes you hungry, it makes you gain weight, it makes you store excess fat. And that's because that's the point of a lot of GMOs is they're meant for livestock to make them fat. And we get a lot of those same grains in our food. So there's a lot of reasons to avoid GMOs. I could go on with this one for a while, but that just sort of like highlights some of it. Try to avoid GMOs as much as possible. All right, number 7 is hydrogenated oils. So this one's no surprise, right? Hydrogenated oils, aka trans fats. So yes, it's true. We need some level of unsaturated and saturated fats, but there is absolutely no need whatsoever for any trans fats. So you can avoid hydrogenated oils like the plague, and you should always. They're bad for you on so many levels. And yes, epidemiological evidence does show us that hydrogenated oils lead to cancer, which again means if you already have cancer, it can make it worse. As you probably know, hydrogenated oils are they added hydrogen to the oils to make them more shelf stable, but it is found that this has many detrimental health effects, mostly for the cardiovascular system. It scars the inside of the arteries, causing the cholesterol that is around to attach to it, clogging up the arteries, leading to heart attacks. It also messes with the hormonal system and the immune system, which again, we don't want. We don't want either of those things with cancer. It makes you hungry, makes you gain weight, makes you depressed, all sorts of stuff. So look on the labels, always be checking labels. Make sure there's no hydrogenated oils or trans fats. And oftentimes the culprit are things like French fries and potato chips. Now, of course, when you go to fast food places, you can't necessarily see all the ingredients, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But yeah, just know that pretty much anything that's fried is probably going to be fried in hydrogenated oils. That's another reason to avoid fried foods. And potato chips are actually so bad for you in so many ways, especially if you have cancer. And both chips and fries also have this component called acrylamide, which is another toxin that's especially bad for you if you have cancer. So number 8 is fast foods and ultra-processed foods. Fast foods basically are ultra-processed foods, but there's other types of ultra-processed foods that aren't fast foods. So I'm putting those together. And these should come as no surprise. I don't need to convince you that they're bad. You already know that. But did you know that if you increased fast foods or ultra-processed foods in your diet, if you increase them only by 10%, it would increase your cancer risk by 12% of any cancer, breast being the most vulnerable. That's not good. And so what is ultra-processed versus processed? Well, I suppose processed would be something like, pasta, bread. Ultra-processed would be like Hamburger Helper, Little Debbie's. You get the idea. And this particular study that I just noted, with a 12% increase in cancer, with a 10% increase in your diet of these processed foods, that study identified as the most problematic processed foods drinks, sugary and fatty products, which cover a lot, and sauces. I thought the sauces part was interesting. But it also makes sense. Store-bought sauces, they're just loaded with all kinds of crap, high fructose corn syrup, bad oils. So yeah, and the thing about fast foods, man, think about this. Fast foods basically contain everything we just talked about on this list so far. You got the low quality meats, you got hydrogenated oils, you got GMOs, you got sugars. It's laden with all of that stuff. So it's basically everything we talked about not doing so far, all in one, all in one little package. And of course, it's addictive, and you don't need me to explain to you why it's bad. But it is important to note that, yeah, fast foods indeed are laden with GMOs, hydrogenated oils, sugars, low quality meat, and MSG, which we didn't exactly talk about MSG, but MSG is not as bad as the artificial sweeteners, but like the artificial sweeteners, it is an excitotoxin. So it does mess with your neurotransmitters. It does make you hungry. It does make you gain weight. It can mess with your mood. It can amp up your immune system, in a bad way, overwork it, activate it unnecessarily. Things of that nature. So of course, it's best to avoid these things while you have cancer. And last but not least, number 9 is refined grains. Refined grains. So why really? Well, I can sum it up quite easily. By the way, even the American Cancer Society recommends to limit refined grains in cancer. But refined grains contribute to oncometabolic syndrome. They lead to oncometabolic syndrome. What is that? Oncometabolic syndrome is something that happens in cancer. It includes metabolic syndrome, which is similar to regular metabolic syndrome without cancer, which is basically like a pre-diabetic state. It contributes to hypercoagulability, thickening of the blood, systemic inflammation, vitamin deficiencies, sustained angiogenesis, which is going to be the tumors creating their own blood vessels to survive. immune incompetence. On top of that, acidity that I mentioned, redox imbalance, hormonal imbalance. Basically, to sum it up real simple, what the refined grains are doing is they're making an environment inside of your body really, really, really nice and cozy and welcoming to the cancer. It makes it very, very, very nice environment for the cancer to thrive and grow. And we don't want that. So we don't want the refined grains. And, the level of badness, I guess you could say, will vary from country to country. For example, Italy's wheat, even Italy's refined wheat, is not nearly as bad as the US's refined wheat. We don't ferment ours long enough, so it's high gluten. It's really hard on the body. There's those types of things to consider. But yeah, so try to avoid the refined grains. So, that's things like anything that white flour is in, basically pastas, breads, baked goods, you know, stuff like that. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed my top 9 list of foods to avoid. Not all of it was surprising, probably. Maybe none of it was. But again, the real value of it is these are the absolute things you should be avoiding. If anything on the planet, avoid this. And it's going to help you out immensely. Once you got this under control, then we can go further. Now, what should we eat or what else can we take out? I've definitely, have found that throwing too much dietary guidance on someone when they're not ready, then they just won't do it. So that's why I like to do these things like one step at a time, just a little bit at a time. And this is like the number one first step. So I hope that was helpful. And I have a gift for you all. In the description box, there's a link to my free article/ebook, The 10 Common Healing Factors Among Cancer Survivors Who Beat the Odds. It is based on decades of research of cancer patients who had spontaneous remissions and what were the 10 things they had in common. And guess what? One of those things was diet and supplements. But they didn't all do the same diet and they didn't all take the same supplements. But there were some common links in their diet and supplements. Find out what they were in that article that you can easily get if you click on the link in the description box. And with that being said, take care, everyone. So much love. And until next time, thank you for being here.